The Appalachian doctor who tried to heal evil with his own blood. This is not a tale of heroism. This is the story of Dr. Samuel Garrison, a man whose lineage was so twisted, so deeply intertwined with itself, that his very existence became a monument to humanity's darkest impulses, hidden deep within the fog-covered mountains of eastern Kentucky. The year was 1947. World War II had ended, and America was rebuilding. But in the remote hollows of Appalachia, where dirt roads barely connected one farmhouse to another, time moved differently. Here in Clay County, Kentucky, the Garrison family had lived for over 130 years, never leaving, never mixing with outsiders, always keeping their bloodline pure in ways that violated every natural law. Samuel Garrison was born in 1920 to a family that had been practicing consanguineous relationships for 5 generations. His grandfather, Ezekiel Garrison, had married his own first cousin in 1875. Ezekiel's son Thomas, Samuel's father, had taken his own niece as a wife in 1898, and Samuel's mother, Ruth, was both his father's niece and the daughter of 2 second cousins. The family tree didn't branch. It folded back onto itself like a rope, tying knots in its own length. The farmhouse where Samuel grew up stood at the end of a narrow valley, surrounded by dense oak and pine forests. The nearest town, Manchester, was 14 miles away by rough mountain paths. The Garrison property consisted of 80 acres of rocky land, a wooden house with a sagging roof, a barn that leaned dangerously to one side, and a small cemetery where generations of Garrisons lay buried, their headstones bearing only a handful of repeated names. Samuel was different from his siblings. While his 3 brothers showed the typical signs of close genetic heritage, Samuel appeared almost normal. His brothers, Jacob, Elijah, and Nathaniel, all displayed physical anomalies. Jacob's eyes sat too far apart on his face, and his jaw protruded at an unnatural angle. Elijah could barely speak, his tongue too large for his mouth, his mind trapped in a fog that never lifted. Nathaniel, the youngest, died at age 7 from complications that no doctor could properly diagnose, his body simply giving up. But Samuel was sharp, intelligent. He learned to read from his mother's Bible by age 5. By 10, he was solving mathematical problems that stumped the traveling teacher who visited their isolated community twice a year. His father, Thomas, saw potential in the boy. Not potential to escape, but potential to serve the family in a new way. In 1938, Thomas Garrison made a decision that would define the next decade. He sold 3 horses and nearly all the family's savings to send Samuel to a small medical college in Lexington, Kentucky. The arrangement was clear. Samuel would learn medicine and return to care for the family. He would become their private physician, their keeper, their protector of secrets. Samuel arrived in Lexington in September 1938, a thin 18-year-old mountain boy who had never seen a paved street or a building taller than 2 stories. The culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Students at the medical college came from educated families, from cities, from a world Samuel couldn't comprehend. They spoke differently, dressed differently, thought differently. But Samuel was brilliant. His professors noticed immediately. He absorbed information like dry earth soaking up rain. Anatomy, physiology, pathology. Samuel excelled in every subject. Yet he never made friends. He never attended social gatherings. Every letter from home reminded him of his purpose, his obligation, his duty to return. During his 2nd year, Samuel took a course in genetics. This was 1939, and the science was still relatively new, still being understood. But what Samuel learned in that classroom struck him like lightning. The professor, Dr. Howard Mitchell, explained Mendelian inheritance, recessive traits, and the dangers of consanguineous reproduction. He showed slides of children born from close family unions, their deformities, their shortened lifespans, their suffering. Samuel sat frozen in his seat, seeing his brothers in every image. understanding for the first time why Nathaniel had died, why Elijah couldn't speak properly, why his mother had lost 4 babies before they reached age 2, why the family cemetery held so many small graves. That night, Samuel wrote a letter to his father. He explained what he had learned. He begged Thomas to end the family's practice. He pleaded for his sisters, Martha and Rebecca, to be allowed to marry outside the bloodline. The response came 3 weeks later, written in his father's barely legible handwriting. "You will come home when your studies are complete. You will do your duty. This is not a discussion." Samuel graduated in 1943, in the middle of World War II. Most of his classmates enlisted or were drafted. Samuel received a medical deferment, classified as essential to an underserved rural community. In reality, his father had pulled strings with local officials, ensuring Samuel would return to the mountains. When Samuel arrived back at the Garrison farmhouse in June 1943, nothing had changed. The house still sagged, the barn still leaned. His father, now 57, looked 70. His mother, Ruth, had aged into a bent, silent woman who spent her days rocking in a chair by the fireplace, staring at nothing. But his sisters had changed. Martha, now 21, was pregnant. Samuel felt his stomach turn when he asked who the father was. His brother Jacob smiled, revealing missing teeth, and said, "We kept it in the family, like always." Rebecca, 19, was promised to Elijah. The wedding would happen in the fall. Samuel spent his first night back in the mountains vomiting behind the barn, his medical education clashing violently with the reality of his family's continuation of these practices. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, because the stories you're about to witness will shatter everything you thought you knew about family bloodlines and the price of isolation. Dr. Samuel Garrison officially opened his medical practice in a converted storage room attached to the family barn in July 1943. His first patients were his own relatives, not just immediate family, but dozens of Garrisons scattered across 3 neighboring valleys, all connected through marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, brothers-in-law and widowed sisters-in-law. The scope of the problem revealed itself slowly, like a wound revealing infection beneath the surface. Samuel began keeping detailed records, documenting every patient, every symptom, every visible deformity. What he discovered horrified him beyond his worst medical school nightmares. Of the 47 living Garrisons he examined in his first year, 31 showed signs of genetic disorders. These ranged from mild, like webbed toes and extra fingers, to severe, like profound intellectual disabilities and fatal heart defects. The infant mortality rate in the family was 63%. Most babies born didn't live to see their second birthday. Samuel documented everything in leather-bound journals he kept locked in a trunk under his bed. He drew family trees that looked less like trees and more like webs, with lines crossing and recrossing until the pattern became almost impossible to follow. He calculated coefficients of inbreeding, measured cranial abnormalities, recorded developmental delays. His sister Martha gave birth in November 1943. The baby, a girl named Sarah, appeared healthy at first, but by 3 months, Samuel noticed she wasn't tracking movement with her eyes. By 6 months, she couldn't hold her head up. By her first birthday, Samuel knew she would never walk, never speak, never live independently. Martha cried every night, holding her daughter, asking Samuel why God had punished her. Samuel couldn't tell her the truth, that God had nothing to do with it, that her father and her brother Jacob were first cousins themselves, making the genetic damage almost inevitable. In early 1944, Samuel decided to act. If he couldn't change the family's ways through persuasion, he would try something different, something desperate, something that, in his isolation and growing madness, began to make terrible sense. He started drawing his own blood, large amounts. He would sit in his converted barn office with a needle in his arm, filling glass bottles with dark red liquid. He believed, through some twisted logic, born from desperation and incomplete medical knowledge, that his blood was different, cleaner. That because he had avoided the worst genetic damage, his blood might carry some protective quality. Samuel began transfusing his own blood into pregnant family members. He started with a distant cousin, Anne Garrison, who was 4 months pregnant by her uncle. Samuel told her he was giving her medicine to help the baby grow strong. 3 times during her pregnancy, he transfused a pint of his blood into her veins. The baby was born with a cleft palate and club feet, but alive. To Samuel, this was progress. Other recent births had been far worse. He expanded his practice. Every pregnant Garrison woman received Samuel's blood. He told himself he was helping, healing, protecting. He told himself he was making a difference. In reality, he was descending into a delusion born from hopelessness, watching his family destroy itself generation after generation and believing his own blood could somehow break the curse they had created. By 1946, Samuel was performing transfusions weekly. He became perpetually anemic, weak, exhausted. His hands shook. His skin turned pale. But he continued, driven by a messianic conviction that he alone could save the Garrison bloodline from itself. His father, Thomas, approved, not because he understood the science, but because Samuel's actions reinforced the family's isolation. No outside doctors were needed. No outsiders would learn their secrets. Samuel was keeping the family's darkness hidden while appearing to fight it. But Samuel's records told a different story. The infant mortality rate hadn't changed. The deformities continued. His blood transfusions did nothing except drain his own health while giving false hope to women who deserved the truth. In his journals, Samuel's handwriting began to deteriorate. His entries became longer, more rambling, filled with medical jargon mixed with biblical references. He wrote about cleansing the bloodline and sacrifice for salvation. He wrote about how his own body was becoming a vessel for the family's redemption. Rebecca married Elijah in October 1945. Samuel performed the ceremony himself, as no outside minister would come to the isolated Garrison property. He watched his 19-year-old sister pledge herself to a man who could barely understand the words being spoken, who drooled constantly, who would certainly pass his profound disabilities to any children they might conceive. 3 months later, Rebecca was pregnant. Samuel began his blood transfusion protocol immediately, taking so much of his own blood that he fainted twice in 1 week. His mother found him unconscious on the barn floor, surrounded by needles and glass bottles, his arm still tied off with rubber tubing. The winter of 1946 brought snow to the Kentucky mountains that piled 4 feet deep in the valleys. The Garrison farmhouse became completely isolated, unreachable by any vehicle, cut off from even the minimal contact they maintained with the outside world. This isolation seemed to accelerate Samuel's descent into obsessive practice. He began taking blood from himself daily. His medical journals from this period show calculations of how much blood a human body could produce, how frequently he could safely extract it, how to maximize his healing capacity, as he called it. He ate liver and spinach constantly, trying to boost his iron levels. He slept 12 hours a day when he could, allowing his body to recover between bloodlettings. By February 1947, Samuel looked like a walking corpse. His cheeks had hollowed out. His eyes sat deep in their sockets, ringed with dark circles. His lips had turned a permanent bluish color. He weighed less than 130 pounds, down from 170 just 3 years earlier. But he continued, because in his deteriorating mind, he was seeing results. Of the last 8 babies born to Garrison women who received his blood, 6 had survived past infancy. Never mind that they all carried visible signs of inbreeding. Never mind that survival didn't mean health. Never mind that his sample size was statistically meaningless. Samuel clung to these numbers like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Rebecca gave birth in July 1947. The labor lasted 18 hours. Samuel assisted, as he did with all family births. When the baby finally emerged, Samuel saw immediately that his blood had changed nothing. The infant, a boy, had severe facial deformities. His skull was misshapen. His fingers were fused together. He lived for 6 hours, gasping for air through a partially formed airway before dying in Rebecca's arms. Samuel recorded the death in his journal with shaking hands. Then he wrote something that revealed how completely he had lost his way. "I must give more. I must give everything. My blood is the only cure. I must drain myself completely to save the next generation." His mother found him that night in the barn, unconscious again, having extracted nearly 3 pints of blood, dangerously close to inducing shock and death. Thomas Garrison, watching his son nearly kill himself, finally began to question whether bringing Samuel home had been a mistake, but it was Martha who confronted Samuel directly. Her daughter Sarah, now 3 years old, could not sit up independently, could not feed herself, would never be able to. Martha had watched her brother deteriorate, had seen him become a ghost in pursuit of an impossible goal. She found him in his room in August 1947, preparing another transfusion kit. "Samuel," she said, her voice breaking, "you're not healing anyone. You're killing yourself for nothing." Samuel looked at her with eyes that no longer seemed to focus properly. "I'm the only one who can fix what we've become. My blood is pure. It's the cure." "Your blood is just blood, Samuel. It can't undo what generations have done." The conversation that followed, documented in Martha's later testimony, lasted 3 hours. She begged him to stop, to leave, to go back to Lexington, to live a normal life, to let the family face the consequences of their own choices. But Samuel refused. He believed too deeply in his mission. He had sacrificed too much to give up now. At the moment that feels impossible to ignore, when Samuel finally broke down crying, admitting he felt powerless, he said something that should echo in every viewer's mind. "I tried to heal evil with my own blood, and all I did was become part of the evil myself." Comment below exactly what Samuel said. "I tried to heal evil with my own blood, and all I did was become part of the evil myself." Let us know you understand the weight of his tragic realization. In September 1947, Thomas Garrison fell ill with pneumonia. Samuel, in his weakened state, tried to care for his father, but lacked the strength to provide adequate treatment. Thomas died on September 23rd at age 61, with Samuel holding his hand, apologizing over and over for failing to save him. The family gathered for Thomas's funeral. Samuel stood at the graveside, barely able to remain upright, watching another Garrison enter the overcrowded cemetery. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had become a doctor to save lives, but all he had managed to do was document death with clinical precision, while adding his own slow demise to the family's tragic ledger. After Thomas Garrison's death, Samuel's mother Ruth emerged from her years of silence with sudden, frightening clarity. She had watched her husband die, watched her son destroy himself, watched her daughters trapped in relationships that produced suffering, and she decided to speak. Ruth gathered the family in October 1947 and told them a story that had never been spoken aloud. She explained that she had tried to leave once, in 1915, before she married Thomas. She had met a man from Manchester, someone outside the family, someone normal. They had planned to run away together, but her father, Ezekiel, had found out. He had beaten her unconscious and locked her in the barn for 2 weeks. When she emerged, the man from Manchester had disappeared. She never saw him again. She told them that of the 11 children she had carried, only 5 had lived past age 2. She described babies born without fully formed brains, infants with organs on the outside of their bodies, toddlers who seized constantly until they died. She spoke for an hour, crying, reliving decades of horror that she had buried beneath silence and resignation. When she finished, she looked directly at Samuel. "You can't fix us, son. We're broken in ways that can't be healed. You need to leave this place. You need to live." But Samuel couldn't leave. Whether from guilt, obligation, or madness, he remained. And his practices became more extreme. He started transfusing his blood into his own siblings, believing that if he couldn't prevent the genetic damage in the next generation, maybe he could somehow improve the current one. He gave blood to Jacob, to Elijah, to Martha, to Rebecca. He extracted so much from himself that he began experiencing cardiac arrhythmias, his heart struggling to pump adequately through a body depleted of its vital fluid. In December 1947, Samuel collapsed during a transfusion procedure. He was found by Rebecca, the needle still in his arm, connected to a tube running into Martha's vein. Both of them were unconscious, Samuel from blood loss, Martha from an adverse reaction. A neighbor, visiting unexpectedly, found them and had to make the difficult journey to Manchester to fetch help. The outside doctor who finally arrived, Dr. Robert Hendricks, was appalled by what he found. Samuel was severely anemic, malnourished, and showing signs of liver damage. Martha had developed a blood infection from non-sterile transfusion equipment. Dr. Hendricks demanded to know what had been happening in the isolated Garrison household. The truth came out slowly. Dr. Hendricks examined the family members and documented what he saw in an official medical report that would later be filed with the Kentucky State Medical Board. The report detailed the extensive consanguinity, the genetic disorders, and Samuel's dangerous self-transfusion practices. Dr. Hendricks tried to convince Samuel to stop, to seek treatment, to let outside medical professionals help the family. But Samuel, even in his weakened state, refused to surrender his journals or his mission. He told Dr. Hendricks that outsiders couldn't understand, that the Garrison family had to be saved by a Garrison. In January 1948, the Kentucky State Medical Board received Dr. Hendricks's report. An investigation was opened. Social workers traveled to the Garrison property. What they found shocked even hardened professionals who had seen poverty and abuse throughout Appalachia. The state moved quickly. Children showing signs of neglect or inability to care for themselves were removed from the property. Sarah, Martha's daughter, was placed in a state institution for the severely disabled. Other young Garrisons were sent to foster homes. The family, which had remained isolated and autonomous for over a century, was forcibly broken apart by outside intervention. Samuel watched helplessly as his nieces and nephews were taken away. He had spent 5 years trying to save the family through his blood, and instead his actions had brought about its destruction. The weight of this realization finally broke him completely. In March 1948, Samuel was admitted to Central State Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Louisville, Kentucky. His admission papers, which still exist in state archives, describe a profoundly depressed, delusional man who believed his blood contained special healing properties and that he had failed in a divine mission to save his family. Martha and Rebecca were left at the Garrison farmhouse with their mother, Ruth. Jacob and Elijah, both unable to care for themselves independently, were also removed to state facilities. The farm, which had been in the family since 1817, was sold for taxes in 1950. The house was demolished. The barn where Samuel had practiced his desperate medicine was burned. Dr. Samuel Garrison spent the remaining 9 years of his life in Central State Hospital. Medical records from his institutionalization reveal a man trapped in circular thinking, unable to escape the belief that he could have succeeded if he had just given more blood, tried harder, sacrificed more completely. He died on November 4, 1957, at age 37, from complications related to chronic anemia and liver failure. His body, drained over years of excessive bloodletting, had finally given up. The official cause of death was cirrhosis, but the underlying cause was much more complex, a mixture of physical self-destruction and psychological dissolution. Samuel's leather-bound medical journals were discovered among his possessions at the hospital. They contained over 800 pages of detailed observations, family trees, genetic calculations, and increasingly disturbed reflections on his mission. These journals were eventually obtained by researchers studying the genetics of isolated populations and the medical history of Appalachia. What those researchers found was a tragic documentation of 5 generations of consanguineous relationships and their consequences. Samuel had methodically recorded the coefficient of inbreeding for every family member, calculated to the 3rd decimal place. For context, a coefficient above 0.0625 is considered high risk. Many Garrison family members had coefficients above 0.25, a level rarely seen in human populations and associated with severe genetic disorders. The journals also revealed that Samuel's transfusion practices, while medically futile, had been his way of trying to atone for the family's history. He couldn't undo generations of harmful unions, couldn't prevent the genetic damage already encoded in every Garrison's cells. So he tried to literally give himself, believing his own blood could wash away inherited sins. It was medicine twisted into a form of self-flagellation, science corrupted by desperation and guilt. Martha Garrison lived until 1983. In interviews conducted in the 1970s by medical historians, she spoke about her brother with a mixture of love and profound sadness. She described him as the smartest person she ever knew and the most tortured. She said he understood the family's problem better than anyone, which made him uniquely unable to accept that he couldn't fix it. Rebecca died in 1969, never having recovered emotionally from losing her son and being separated from her remaining children. Ruth Garrison lived to age 88, dying in 1975, having outlived most of her children and grandchildren. In her final years, she told anyone who would listen that the family should have left the mountains generations ago, that isolation had been their true curse, not their bloodline itself. The Garrison story became a case study in genetic counseling textbooks throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Samuel's journals provided unprecedented documentation of the effects of sustained consanguinity across multiple generations. Universities in Kentucky and Tennessee used his records to teach medical students about recessive genetic disorders and the importance of genetic diversity. But beyond the scientific value, Samuel's story represents something darker and more troubling: the danger of isolation, the weight of tradition, and the terrible consequences when families turn inward instead of outward. The Garrisons believed they were preserving their bloodline's purity, but they were actually destroying it, concentrating harmful recessive traits until nearly every birth resulted in suffering. Samuel thought he could heal evil with his own blood. He believed his sacrifice could redeem his family's history. But what he couldn't see, what his intelligence and medical training couldn't reveal, was that some damage goes too deep for any individual to repair. Some sins, if they can be called that, are multi-generational, embedded in the very genetic code passed from parent to child. The Appalachian doctor who tried to heal evil with his own blood ultimately became another casualty of the evil he fought against. His story isn't about heroism or redemption. It's about the terrible price of recognizing a problem too late, of being born into circumstances that were already broken beyond repair, and of sacrificing oneself for a cause that was lost before it began. Today, the Garrison farmhouse is gone. The cemetery remains, overgrown with weeds and honeysuckle, the headstones barely readable. Few people remember the family that lived in that isolated valley, the doctor who tried to save them, or the tragedy that unfolded across 5 generations. But the journals remain, kept in the archives at the University of Kentucky, a permanent record of one man's desperate, doomed attempt to use medicine to fix what could only be prevented by breaking generations of tradition. If you've watched until here, it means this story impacted you as deeply as it should. Se você assistiu até aqui é porque gostou dessa história. Deixe um comentário dizendo: eu assisti até aqui, para que eu possa te conhecer e saber quem realmente gosta das histórias aqui do canal. And if this story opened your eyes to the dark realities of isolated bloodlines, click like so others can learn what happens when families turn inward for generations. Share this with someone who needs to understand that some traditions should be broken, not preserved. And subscribe, because the next story goes even deeper into the hidden histories of families that the world forgot. Samuel Garrison's tombstone in the hospital cemetery bears only his name and dates. No epitaph, no explanation. Just another forgotten life in a forgotten corner of Appalachia. But his story, documented in his own hand, ensures that the price he paid and the family he couldn't save will never be completely forgotten.